Everyone, and welcome to our latest round of APIsec University Presents. We're here today in a little bit of a different situation. So my name's Christine Bevilacqua. I work with Dan and Corey over at APIsec University. And today's an exciting day for me because I get to sit in Dan's seat. Normally, Dan's the host for all of these, but today I get to play Dan and I get to actually interview Dan around API security for PCI compliance, which is a course that Dan recently wrote and recorded and published out on APIsec University. If you haven't been out there to check it out yet, you should. So Dan, thanks for letting me play you today. And hopefully
we're going to do a much better job.
Yeah. And hopefully you can all bear with us. Normally I'm in the background managing the chat and the logistics. So Dan and I are going to manage the chat in real time today. So if we miss you, we'll catch you before the end if you've got questions. But thank you all for joining us. As we open up, Dan, I wanted to just put a little poll out for our audience today, asking them. So we're here talking about PCI compliance, and we're going to jump into PCI-DSS 4.0. So before we jump into that, I was just going to ask everyone, how familiar is everyone with PCI-DSS 4.0 requirements? So we're pushing the poll live. If you guys want to take a few minutes to answer where you're at with your understanding comprehension of DSS4. In the meantime, Dan, tell us, so before we dive deep into PCI geek speak, maybe let's just lay the groundwork. Why APIs? Why are we talking about APIs when it comes to PCI compliance?
Yeah, and hey everybody, glad to be joining y'all again, and thank you, Christine, for hosting today. Yeah, it wouldn't be an APIsec University webinar without a little bit of background. So promise we'll dive right into the DSS 4.0. What does it mean? What you should be aware of from an API security standpoint. I actually have some good tools to share with you towards the end of the call. But just to, let's just level set real quick. And hey, Troy, thanks for joining from my hometown, DC. We were at a PCI conference last week, and we got a lot of questions from folks about, why they should be worried about APIs. And really, we answered with these three things, right? It's pretty simple stuff, right? APIs are everywhere, right? We have this API explosion. The number's probably more than 83% these days of the internet traffic is API traffic, right? APIs power pretty much everything. And if you think about transactions, e-commerce, open banking, all the credit card transactions, I'd be surprised if hardly any are not powered by APIs, right? They absolutely dominate the traffic there. So that's pretty much a given. The next one is more alarming, which is APIs are under attack, right? And if you've taken our courses, you've known well that API attacks are being successful, right? They're being wildly successful, right? You're not losing 10, 20, 100 records, but more like 10 or 100 million records, right? So the automated sort of nature of APIs makes them really ripe for massive data loss. And Gartner's been saying for years, API attacks will become the most frequent attack vector by last year. And I think they stand squarely behind that prediction. And then the third is probably even more alarming. Our APIs are pretty severely under secured, right? And this is some statistics from Rapid API. They looked at, what percent of all our API testing is geared towards security. And it's only, according to them, 4%. And whatever the number is, we know it's really low. It's way too low. And there are lots of reasons why APIs don't get tested enough. They're just, there's certain things about them that are really tricky.
Yeah. So PCI though has always covered application security. So what's the difference between AppSec and APIsec, and why talk specifically about APIs? Isn't AppSec cover sort of everything?
Yeah. So you're a great alley-oop front man here. So that brings us right into here. API attacks are different, right? we spend a lot of time with a lot of technologies, tools. I come from, the vulnerability scanning world originally, that look at our front end, right? Web app scanning and, vulnerability testing, source code analysis, all that kind of thing. We put a lot of effort into testing our front end, right, to make sure they're free of injection flaws or cross-site scripting or, you know, denial of service type of things. Um, and what we've seen over and over and over again is those UIs are powered by APIs. And if there are any flaws that exist at the API level, those are being exposed, right? And attackers are going right around the UI straight to the API level. And one of our sort of big best practices that we talk a lot about in our presentations in our courses is we are over relying on the UI as a security enforcement layer, right? Not just to present our banks or to present our vacation booking website or whatever it is that our companies do. They're going beyond presentation all the way through to security enforcement, right? So the UIs are controlling what you can do, what data you can see, what buttons you can press, all of those kinds of things. But if you're going around the UI, all those controls disappear, right? And we find APIs, or attackers find APIs that are way over permissioned, return way more data than they ought to, have authorization flaws, logic flaws. And you can see why attackers are targeting the API layer. So that's turning out to be a very fruitful target for them. The undersecured part is APIs present a different kind of vulnerability. What you don't see a lot in the breaches are you don't see a lot of injection vulnerabilities or these sort of common vulnerabilities. What tends to result in the big breaches are weak authentication, gaps in authorization. So I can log in as Dan, but then pivot and look at Christine's data, or logic flaws. Right? I'm using your API in ways that it was not intended to be used. Right? And testing for those scenarios is really tricky, and that's why we often find vulnerabilities that are ripe for exploiting.
Yeah. And, one of the things that really brought this home for me, the notion of how different API attacks are, and not to plug it, but in the security fundamentals, the API security fundamentals course on APIsec U, there's a whole section that you go through a whole bunch of different exploits in regards to the OWASP API top 10, and you kind of lay out different API attacks that have been successful. And that helped me to better understand really the nature of API attacks and why they are so different than your traditional AppSec vulnerabilities. So for all of you who are listening, if you haven't been on the security fundamentals, like definitely a great section there that really dives deep into how this happens, what the vulnerabilities are. Yeah.
And I see a question here. Would an API be considered a Y1, Y2, or Y3? I'm not sure what that means. If you can elaborate on what you mean by that.
So I think let's see if what their elaboration is. Maybe as we dive into the next section, that's probably a good tee up for what, why are we talking about this now? What's the time sensitive nature of PCI-DSS 4 and the requirements as they relate to API security?
Got it. So we're talking about year 1, year 2, year 3. Yeah. I think if that's what you mean, it's a year 0, really, honestly. Like the breaches are happening. We need to get on it, and we'll talk about, I think, in the coming slides, what does that mean around PCI specifically. But I think what we're talking about here is very relevant, whether you're PCI compliant or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. Really, it shouldn't take PCI compliance to make sure that you've got a strong API security program in place. That should be there, whether there's a PCI deadline looming behind you or not. That said, PCI-DSS does have a very specific timeline behind it, behind the 4.0 requirements. And I think that it is a good forcing function for those organizations, and especially for AppSec, or InfoSec professionals who are trying to get better API security programs in place, but we all know, there's never enough people in security, and funding is always something that's a challenge. So, having something like DSS that helps justify why API security needs to be a focus and why it's timely is not a bad thing. So let's, I'm not sure if we answered your question on the Y1, Y2, or Y3. If we missed it, hit us with more specifics. But otherwise, Dan, do you want to run us through what the timeline looks like for 4.0?
Yeah, and just commenting more broadly on 4.0 in general, right? So 4.0 was released last year, 2022, the beginning of the year. And as you can see here, as of Q2 last year, the transition period started. You have until Q1 next year to actually comply with 4.0, right? So this is looming, right? We have about, I don't know, 6-7 months left until 4.0 is mandatory for everyone. You have to have achieved compliance. I see Eduardo's comment. It's not like you're well on your path, and you well should be. The 4.0 update is the first major release in almost 10 years, right? 3.0 came out, I think, in 2014, plus or minus. 3.2.1, which is the latest version of the prior standard, came out in around 2016, 2017. So it's been a while since DSS came out with a new standard, and 4.0 is a significant update. You could see it grew from 139 pages to 360. So there's a lot in there. One of the things that's new that didn't exist before is APIs. So if you were actually to look at 3.2.1 and look for APIs, you won't find it. It's not mentioned one time. It's not in there. The world has changed since then. Certainly APIs existed back then, but now they really are pervasive. And so you will find specific mention throughout DSS 4.0 around APIs. We talk a lot about that in the course. We'll actually touch on that here in this webinar. And then, but it goes beyond the sections that actually mention APIs by name, and we'll dig into that. Right, it's very relevant throughout 4.0, and certainly relevant for your auditors. Giovanni, your question: how deep is the practical part of the course? The course really focuses on DSS 4.0, right? So it's a deep dive into the 4.0 regulations. It goes section by section by section. Really extracting, what does this mean? What are the implications? What do you have to do around APIs for that? So that's really the focus of the course. If you want to get more hands-on, highly recommend our API penetration testing course. It's really fantastic. It's taught by our good friend Corey Ball, author of the Hacking APIs book. And if you want to go deep, that's the course to take. If you want to learn more about API risks, highly recommend our OWASP Top 10 course, and plenty more. We've got lots of good courses, but those are the ones that I'd recommend for you. You're welcome, Giovanni. Christina, are we good to continue?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that really jumps out at me on this slide is just the graph on the right? So just the notion of how much meatier DSS 4 is and how much more there is to consider. I'm gonna reveal the results of our poll. That's part of why we asked the poll question that we asked, right? How familiar are you with the DSS 4 requirements? Because it's more than double, just in sheer volume, the requirements that existed in 3.2.1. So there's a lot to consider, right? And that's part of when Dan was thinking up this course, and Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was, it's easy to get lost in the sheer volume of how much there is around these requirements and PCI. And we wanted to make it really simple as it comes to API security, in terms of what is relevant specifically around API security. So I think that I really appreciated that the course made it easier to sift through the 360 something pages and understand what's relevant to APIs.
Indeed, right. And what we want to do here in the coming slides is highlight or extract a few of the more salient sections of DSS. We do also have, and we'll share this at the end of the session, we've condensed the 369 pages or however many it is to 4 or 5 pages. We actually have a worksheet that we call it a self-assessment. It's got a number of questions you should be asking yourself or asking your colleagues around API security. And I'm happy to make that worksheet available to anybody that would like it. All you got to do is just comment, and we'll make sure we get you a copy of it. We'll show it to you here towards the end. But let's actually go that layer deeper, right, and look into what's in the DSS 4.0. And if you're familiar with PCI and DSS, you know there are 12 sections to it. Section 6 is really the one that is most applicable to APIs and application security in general. It's entitled, Secure Software and Applications. So I like to just take, raw content right out of the sort of the horse's mouth, right? So everything you see here is actual PCI screenshots, content from the DSS 4.0 documents. Yeah, you'll see this all in the course as well. There is this concept of bespoke and custom software that is referenced probably hundreds of times throughout the 4.0 document. And what is bespoke and custom software? It's what it says, right? It's the code that you write that's unique to your organization, or code that is written for you, maybe by a consultant or third party. Whatever you're using to operate your applications, to deliver the functionality that your business delivers, frankly covered here under bespoke and custom software, right? And part of that includes APIs. So there are a lot of sections in DSS 4.0 that talk about bespoke and custom software that may not explicitly say APIs. That doesn't mean APIs aren't relevant. They're still extremely relevant, right? And the way I like to think about it is, as you're reading through the DSS document, if that particular section, all right, if that risk is relevant to your attackers, right? So if APIs are in scope for an attacker, then they're in scope for you, right? And you should be thinking about them as you're looking through this document from a testing perspective, a monitoring perspective, a secure development perspective, inventory perspective. If your attackers are looking at your APIs for this, then you need to be looking at it, right? And so here we just start at the very top. This is 6.0. So this is the highest level guidance, which is to securely develop our software and applications. And that security vulnerabilities you see under 6.3, security vulnerabilities are identified and addressed, right? And so the rest of the document goes into more detail, but this is just setting the stage, right? This is probably one of the meatiest parts of the DSS 4.0. And it's basically saying you got to make sure you're developing your API, your apps securely. APIs are part of your apps, so they need to be part of your security conversation.
And I noticed down there, just there's a little note in the fine print around applying software, secure software lifecycle processes and secure coding techniques. And I just wanted to put a little, for those of you who missed it, maybe a month and a half ago, we had a great session with the former chief technology officer from
Apply, yeah.
Yeah. And we talked all about secure software development frameworks and implementing secure coding practices in the software development lifecycle. So that's a great resource as well.
Oh, yeah, sorry, not Stoplight. You're talking about from the U.S. Army. Yeah,
yes,
Chief Software Officer. Indeed, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll drop that in the chat, but that's out on our YouTube channel for those of you who are, wanting to learn more about how do you do some of this during the software development lifecycle. There's some great resources out there as well.
And that's actually a really good segue into actually, before we go into the training one, the secure software development lifecycle really, frankly, is about integrating security as far left as you can, right? Yeah. That's really the best practice here. The nature of vulnerabilities that are getting exposed through your APIs is their application vulnerabilities, right? It's logic that's being exposed. It's gaps in your authorization or your weak authentication or whatever it might be. And more often than not, the fix is also inside your applications. right? I mean, an application is not going to protect you from a denial of service, right? So you need to have the right networking infrastructure and that sort of thing, right? But logic flaws, you're not going to fix by bolting something on after the fact, right? You need to be writing secure code in the first place. You want to prevent vulnerabilities from ever creeping into your applications. And that's all about shifting left, right? And in fact, 6.2.1, which was not, we don't have a slide on that here, but it is in the course, talks about secure software development, right? And the
Yep.
need to integrate security as far left as possible, to detect vulnerabilities in the software release process, and to make sure that developers, the people creating your content, creating your applications, are aware of those risks. And maybe that's the perfect segue here into 622, which is annual developer training, right? So this is not a new one for DSS. This was in 3.2.1 and many of the prior editions as well. But what's interesting here is the focus on developer training for security purposes, right? So annual developer training on things like secure software design. You'll see that here in the left side box. Secure coding practices, right? Make sure that developers are getting trained on software security relevant to their job function. Okay. If you're developing APIs, you better be training and educating your developers on API risks, API security issues. The third bullet on the left talks about security testing tools, right? So not
Mm.
just secure coding, but how are we going to go about testing for vulnerabilities, right? And make sure we're training and providing that kind of education as well, right? So this is really quite interesting to us. We're pleased that DSS recognizes the importance of developer training, and of course, we've got a whole bunch of good training on the APIsec U website. In fact, we started APIsec U with Corey's pen testing course, which quickly led to a lot of inbound requests for training that's geared more towards a developer audience, and that's what led to the creation of the API Security Fundamentals course. It's much lighter weight, only 90 minutes. It covers real world breaches, the OWASP top 10. And in fact, a lot of folks, a lot of organizations are now deploying our courses in house, right? Frankly, the point being, like, they want to be able to train or enforce training on their colleagues, and want to be able to track their completion. So we actually offer our courses to be downloaded and deployed in an internal learning platform. So if that's of interest to you, hit me up. Happy to tell you all about it. But you can actually deploy APIsec U courses internally so that you can then assign them to your colleagues and track their completion.
And so we have a question in the chat, which is actually maybe a good segue into another section of 6.2, which is around software code reviews. So the question was, would you say if testing, when you're testing the code, is that dynamic application security testing, DAST testing, or pen testing, or maybe both? So really, what does that mean?
Yeah, this is a great question, Eduardo. We are big proponents of attacking your own software, right? Like, you should attack simulate. You should make it, a regular part of your software release cycle. No one questions doing performance testing, unit testing, functionality testing. That goes without saying. Whenever you're doing a new release into production, why isn't security part of that? Well, the only reason it's not is because it's hard, right? You can't do a manual pen test on every release, right? It's just not feasible. And manual pen testing is kind of hit or miss, right? The pen tester you hire today is going to test for very different things than the one you hire at the end of the year. So I would call it, honestly, Edward, I'd call it DAST, right? You want to be testing the functionality of your API. And when we say API, we're really actually testing your app. The API is just simply the interface to that backend functionality. And it makes a great sort of interface for testing purposes, not just from a usability perspective or integration perspective, but highly recommend that you do dynamic testing on your application. We don't plug a lot of stuff ourselves, but our own company, APIsec.ai, this is what we do, right? We have a dynamic tester for APIs. It's incredibly effective, very comprehensive. It basically will analyze your API and craft thousands of attack scenarios to really allow you to pressure test your API and find those vulnerabilities before they ever go into production. And I would just say you want to be testing ahead of production, right? Like it's one thing to test in production. That's, kind of more of a validation test, if you will. But the real best practice here, Eduardo, is to test your APIs ahead of production, right? So shift left, make it part of your CI/CD pipeline, and make it keep up with your developers, right? If your developers are pushing code every week, then make sure you're testing every week. Or if it's every day, then test every day. And that just sort of argues for the need for automation, right? You're not going to get there doing it manually.
And that is I mean, I think that is highlighted in that secure code review or software code review requirement for.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So DSS, I really like PCI because unlike a lot of compliance regulations out there, it's very specific, right? It says these are the things you got to do, right? If you look at HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley or GDPR, it basically says, hey, you got to keep my people's records private. How you do it, that's up to you. Well, PCI is very explicit. It tells you things like you've got to do annual developer training, you have to do software code reviews, right? And here in 623, you see that the DSS really recognizes that your apps, your code is going to be a primary target for attackers. It just is, right? And they even mention APIs you see on the box on the right specifically, right? Like APIs are under attack, right? So you need to be thinking about your APIs you write, the APIs you use, right? And review them for any vulnerabilities. And you actually see at the very bottom of the left box, prior to release, right? Make sure you're testing for these things, fixing them before they ever get into production. And I really am keen on the last bullet on the right, checking the application's behavior to detect logical vulnerabilities. This is, I think, a new concept for a lot of folks, right? We're used to looking for kind of CVEs, common vulnerability entities. That's what they're even called. Well, these are not common. These are uncommon vulnerabilities. These are your vulnerabilities. These are logic flaws, right? Can your API be abused, used in ways you didn't intend? And we're real good at testing, what we call positive testing. Like, does the API do what we want it to do? You need to be testing negative scenarios, right? Can it be used in ways that we don't want to allow, right? Like, can I set the price that I'm paying you for this good to be negative $10, right? So, all right, you owe me $10 now because I just purchased this thing. That's a logic flaw, right? It's a very simple one, but you know what? It's not impossible, right? If your app logic doesn't account for all those scenarios, you're going to find yourself vulnerable to logic attacks. And if you take our fundamentals course, you'll see plenty of examples of exactly that.
I was just going to say, I remember there were several really good examples in the security fundamentals course of logic flaws that could have been caught if they had been, tested, if that negative testing had been applied before they went live, which that's another great segue into the common vulnerabilities, right? So those are uncommon, but the common vulnerabilities, the OWASP.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly, right? So we sort of covered the uncommon in the last section, but that doesn't mean the common ones are not relevant. So I think of this section 624 as kind of the OWASP section of DSS. It's sort of the kitchen sink. So the box on the left, the bottom left, you'll see, again, attacks on business logic, right? Attempts to abuse or bypass application features. All right, those are not common, right? So there you go. But it's also things like looking at injections, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, right? a lot of the things that you see in the OWASP top 10 are being captured here, right? So you need to make sure you're testing for any of these types of vulnerabilities in your code. Over on the far right, they sort of reinforce this whole shift left. They even call it there. You can see it in quotes. The shifting security left mantra, right? So get out ahead of these vulnerabilities. Actually be testing your APIs regularly as part of the release cycle, and of course, identifying issues and fixing them before they ever go live.
And I know that there's a couple more that round out the meat section, which is really six, all of six, right? Around
Yep.
inventory and protection.
Yeah, and sure enough, right? Wouldn't be a proper API conversation without talking about inventory, right? So this one, I don't. Oh, it actually does mention APIs by name. You see it on the far right, third-party APIs, but you got to know what you're working with, right? So have an inventory of all your bespoke and custom software. That's got to include all of your APIs. If you've taken our fundamentals course, our 3 pillars of API security are governance, testing, and monitoring. We really believe strongly that it starts with governance, right? And having a proper inventory and knowledge of all of your APIs is crucial. That's where it's got to start. We believe the way to get there is through things like central management of your APIs, central deployment of your APIs using tools like an API gateway, having a well-defined release process. So rogue and shadow and unknown APIs really shouldn't be happening, and hopefully can't be happening in your organization. We really believe that's the best approach. In terms of developing your inventory, we get this question a lot, like how do you go find these things? And for security teams, it's very appealing to go put video cameras all over the network, right? Install sensors and traffic watchers to identify and detect APIs as they happen. That's one approach. It's not an approach I personally love because it's only going to catch what it sees, right? So if you aren't instrumenting that part of the network, or if an API endpoint isn't being actually exercised, you're not going to know about it, right? But at the end of the day, it's just sort of like a tax, right? It's just one more thing you got to do. When in reality, what really needs to be happening is security teams and development teams need to be talking a lot more, right? Like too often we talk to security teams that don't know what APIs they have, don't know what an API specification is, aren't sure if there's a gateway in use at all. And that just to me says we need better communication, right? The APIs may not be known to you, they're known to the organization. I guarantee you, right? If you're a bank, someone definitely knows what APIs are powering your banking app, your e-commerce app, your mobile app, the website. Those are well known, may not be known to security. So let's start by having those conversations, right? And then, and then go into all of the other things, right? Like, what are we doing about those APIs? How are we testing? How are we looking for vulnerabilities? But for sure, having a proper, accurate, up-to-date, secure software inventory is critical.
And I know that we've had some great conversations with partners that we work with that, to your point, Dan, have done a really good job of solving for this in their own organizations. And I think we've got, for anyone who's struggling with this or that this rings true for, we've got a session coming up, I believe, in early November, tackling this topic and talking about how others are solving for this and how you can go about it in your organization as well.
Yeah, we sure do. We're just putting the details together. I'm really excited because people talk a lot about not software inventory. They talk about or API inventory. They talk about API discovery, and it's sort of a misnomer. Like these are somehow mysterious entities that need to be magically uncovered. They're generally not. But we're gonna have a whole session to talk about that. I know I want to scooch through 2 more real quick, if that's all right, Christine.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's roll.
So this one's interesting. I actually blended 2 together, 641 and 642. Basically, this has to do with protection. And 641 gives you a choice. It says you can either do annual vulnerability testing, and scanning, or you can do automated blocking, detection and blocking, right? Sort of I mean, web app firewall style thing. And you see that's even mentioned under the examples on the right. Um, the blocking requirement actually becomes mandatory for 2025. So you get an extra year to get that one done. Until then, you have a choice. You can do the annual vulnerability assessment, or you can do the blocking, automated blocking and tackling. This one's a little curious to me because on the one hand, they're saying annual vulnerability assessment, and in all the sections, they're basically saying you got to test your APIs or your applications, and you need to be able to find issues before they go live. So all I think about this one is it's reinforcing the need to find our vulnerabilities and to protect our applications from automated attacks, bot attacks, and that sort of thing. The one sort of piece of color I guess I would add here is for sure you should do runtime monitoring, blocking, detection, and the like. Web application firewalls have been around for decades for exactly that purpose, and you should be using that, right? If your site is under some sort of volumetric attack, you need a tool that's going to block it, that's going to stop it, right? There's no code in your logic that's going to prevent that attack from happening. So you do need runtime protections. Now, it's important to understand the limitations, though, right? They are not going to block logic attacks, right? Or, authorization attacks, because frankly, that's too nuanced, right? Is Dan logging in and accessing his own records, or is he accessing Christine's? That's a really tough scenario to detect in real time, right? And frankly, that is best tackled in the application code itself, rather than trying to rely on something bolted on. You want to make sure your API or your app logic is as sound as possible, right? And so make sure that I can't access anyone else's records, right? That needs to be enforced in the application logic itself.
So I know that that kind of covers the meat of 6, but I did note that there were some other requirements much deeper in the DSS 4. So do we want to hit those before we?
Yeah, this is the last slide here on security testing. And Eduardo, I'll come back to your very good question here. Actually, I just wanted to flag 11.0 security testing. There's a whole lot more detail in here that you can find, but it actually sort of reinforces this whole concept of vulnerabilities being continually discovered, right? They're being targeted by your attackers, right? They're looking for these types of vulnerabilities. And I've highlighted here, bespoke and custom software need to be tested frequently, right? Not once a year, ideally on every release. You don't want to put code out there that hasn't been tested. That's true from a functionality perspective. It's equally true from a security perspective. So that's what 11 is all about. So just kind of reinforces how important our second of the three pillars testing really is. To your question, Eduardo, thoughts around WAP, web application API protection. So my thoughts are you want to employ runtime protection, but you need to be realistic about what level of threat it can protect you from. Injections, yes. Volumetric attacks, yes. Authorization attacks, tricky, right? Logic attacks, very unlikely, right? It's very difficult. And the reason why, it's not a knock on these products, but if you think about what happens in runtime, right? Your detection tool is going to see a request. It's going to be an HTTP request. It's going to say, I'm going to look for this endpoint with this object ID, and it's going to come from this authenticated user. Okay. How do you make a judgment in a millisecond of whether that's a valid request or not? Right? Does that object, is that user authorized to that object? Maybe you could get a runtime solution to be that smart. It'd be difficult, but maybe it's possible. But isn't the better solution to make that type of request impossible with the logic that exists in your application, right? Isn't it a better approach to say, our developers are developing code that doesn't allow that exploit to even happen, right? Even if you turned off the runtime protection, our engine, our code is written sound enough that those type of logic flaws or those gaps don't actually exist. So it's not to say runtime isn't needed. It's very much needed, but you need to know what it's good for and where you'll still have gaps that you need to fill. So I hope that answered your question, Eduardo. From Anonymous, another question. What attributes, flaws, threats, and vulnerabilities, in your opinion, cannot be scanned? I think we just sort of kind of talked about that as well. I think the more sophisticated, the more custom the attack, the more difficult it is to write a signature for it, right? So if I'm gonna like take the Coinbase example where the user literally used the API to modify the what they were selling from Ethereum to Bitcoin, right? Like I can't think of how you would write a signature for that unless you wanted to create thousands upon thousands upon thousands of signatures for every possible conceivable scenario, right? So there is a role, an important role for your developers here in security. This is why I think security teams need to be communicating more with dev teams, which is to make sure they're aware of what the risks are and what they look like and how to write better, more secure, more sound code. And we've seen actually a lot of organizations, one of the sort of best practices we hear from chief security officers is to embed security champions, or whatever you want to call them, right into the development organization, right? So put security expertise and personnel right within the dev teams themselves, right, and help create that culture of security. So Christine, that gets us through all of the sort of DSS content. So
yeah, it does. We might be able to answer these questions as we jump into the next section as well. But we had a question about are there any resources that we have or that we know of that talk specifically about PCI technical requirements and what you should approach from a pen testing perspective? I know this is a little bit broader, but great question.
There are, right? And obviously, we've put some of this content out ourselves. You're probably familiar with APIsec University. That's why you're probably here on this call. First place I would point you to is our API security for PCI compliance course. It's free. It's on our website, apisecuniversity.com. It's a lot of the content you've seen here today, but in more depth, in more detail. So that's a great place to go to. I think there were questions about, checklist for what to look for. I would recommend the fundamentals course. I'd recommend the OWASP course. And if you really want to get your hands dirty and start hacking your APIs and really looking for those vulnerabilities directly, then check out the pen testing course as well. We have, kind of based on popular demand, we actually have created a DSS 4.0. We call it a self-assessment worksheet. It really, you see a little screenshot there. It's about a 5 or 6 page document, but it goes through each of the sections, summarizes what it's all about, and then poses a number of self-assessment questions. And so, yeah, if you're online and you want access to this, please just, say hi. I'd like one, please, whatever it is, just let us know you like it. We'll follow up and send it to you. But this is a great question there for you to be asking yourself, sharing with your colleagues to find out, what are we doing to address API requirements. And of course, there's a March deadline looming, right? It's just around the corner, and this stuff becomes mandatory, right? Like you have to comply by March. That's what your auditors are going to be looking at. And so let us know if you like a copy of this worksheet.
Yeah, I will say this was definitely a big hit at the PCI community meeting that we were at last week, right? A lot of people looking for this level of guidance and just the clarity around what specifically they need to do for API security. Again, at 360 plus pages, it's a lot to digest. So when you're trying to think of just, one area, this is a great resource for that one area. As Dan mentioned, I see a bunch of people have already asked in the chat for the checklist. So we've caught all of you and we'll send you an email following the session with a copy of this assessment checklist. And then, you know, one of the other things that everyone was asking is the replay link. So all the replay links for all of our webinars are posted out on our YouTube channel, and we get them up there as quickly as we possibly can. So this one should be up on our YouTube channel shortly this afternoon, and we'll send a note to everyone who was registered today with a link off to that replay as well. Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thanks for letting me play you today. We'll give it a couple more. Does anyone else have any questions before we head out? Otherwise,
and Christine, can you share like some of the stuff we got coming?
Yes, that's what I was just going to do. So if there are no other questions, I'll give you guys a little plug for our next session. So we are really excited in a couple of weeks to welcome Confidence Stavely. And if you're not familiar with who Confidence is, she actually just won the Cybersecurity Woman of the Year award for 2023 for all of her work in making API, not just API security, cybersecurity in general, and API security specifically, much more relatable and accessible to the broader market all over the world. And she's going to talk to us about her API Kitchen, which is this awesome, again, if you haven't caught it, it's out on LinkedIn. She launched this series specific to API security, and it's fantastic. So we're really excited to welcome Confidence. That's on October 5th, and you can already register for that. So if you go back to our kind of Crowdcast channel, you can register for that. And then I think, Dan, we've got another one coming up with Upstream, right? In October, I believe that's October 24th. And that one will have a link to register for that up shortly. And that webinar is going to be really exciting as well.
Yeah, that one's going to be all about automotive API security. So I'm really excited to partner with Upstream on that. Thank you, Giovanni, for the plug of our good friend Corey's book, Hacking APIs. Highly recommend it for everyone. I had the honor of writing the foreword for it. It's really the companion to our pen testing course. But no, we're going to be talking with Upstream about automotive API security and connected cars, and it's pretty remarkable some of the breaches that have taken place on cars. So I'm super excited to be doing that one too. That
was a great session, Hacking Cars. If you missed that, it's out on our YouTube channel as well. But that was an awesome session with Sam, and I think this one's a lot of practical advice on how to prevent just such an attack on your own APIs. We do have one more question out here for if PCI has certain requirements around maybe MFA, things like that, account lockouts.
Yeah, I use they do, right? We didn't cover a lot of that. It is definitely covered in the DSS requirements. There's a lot of requirements around encryption and how PANs, primary account numbers are stored and secured and all of that. We didn't touch on that here today because we're focused really on API security specifically. But yes, there's a lot of like non-default credentials, multi-factor authentication. That's a lot of some of the new requirements that are part of the new DSS. And for folks who are asking me where to sign up for the new webinars,
I just dropped that in the chat too.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you for that. We'll also send an email out. So if you didn't capture that, don't worry. We will send you a note that's got links to these upcoming sessions. I think the Confidence Stavely one is going to be fantastic. I can't wait to watch that one myself, Christine. I think it's going to be truly phenomenal. So
yeah, we're excited to chat with her. Okay, well, I think, if there are no other questions, typically we try and give you back 10, 15 minutes of your day. So that was a great session. Thank you so much. And thanks again for entertaining me and letting me play host today to interview you. It was great. And I learned a lot around PCI compliance. Wow. And I thought I knew a lot, and I still have more to learn.
Yeah, well, appreciate it. Thanks everyone for dialing in. We'll get those worksheets out to everyone that requested them, and safe journeys out there. Keep your organization safe. Keep APIs in mind, and we'll see you next time.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.